Welcome back everybody to my channel. How y'all doing? Sunday, God bless everybody. Today I'm doing a video based on true Arthurian story that happened back in the 70s. I made some movies about it one time called Deep Water, Blackwater, Rogue and everything. It's based on a true story and everything. Basically it's like this right here. Way back then, back in the 70s, a group of research scientists had headed deep into the mangrove swamps of Northern Territory in Australia. They soon knew why these parts are so treated. It's a long story happened way back in the 70s. 70s, 80s, or 60s right here. Basically, they went out there and they got attacked by a big old crocodile. And everything. Just like, and everything like that. You see stories about it too. But let's go ahead and get into the video, shall we?
All I'm saying is a warning, fella. Sometimes fellas like you go in them swamps without a blessing. And sometimes, them fellas don't ever come back. The pointed words of the Gunawingu elder echoed in my ears as we followed the winding tributary deep into a dark, heavy mass of tidal mangrove swamp. There had been no malice or threat in them. Just an unnerving certainty that my boss seemed to miss entirely as he snorted something about superstitious nonsense and thanked the man for nothing. I kind of wondered why he'd even bothered seeking the elder's blessing if he was just going to go ahead with the trip anyway. Image, I suppose. If there was one thing Dr. Irvin Wexley cared about more than anything, it was image. I apologized for his disrespect and asked the man if there was anything I could offer that would compensate for his wasted time. He gave me a kindly smile and shook his head. "It's all good, mate. Some fellas'll never learn. Nothing a man can do about that. You got enough respect to apologize, even though you done nothing wrong. And that's enough for an old fella like me. Ain't your fault the boss don't got any." I shook his hand, thanked him again and turned to leave. But his hand tightened around mine, lingering for a moment. "You just be careful out there, mate. Them swamps have been around a long time, before us folk even got here. And fellas like your old boss there tend to attract trouble. Look, there are good people and there are not so good people. And that's true of anything beings are involved with. Science is no different. And Wexley was definitely the latter. Arrogant, egotistical, and only worried about progress if it personally benefited him in some way. The man could not have been more pompous and self-serving if he'd tried. More than once he'd managed to beat accusations of stealing others' work and publishing it as his own. He also hired mostly young female research scientists, and it only took a couple of days of observing his behavior around them for me to work out why. Wexley might have been a prehistoric dick, but he had a lot of influence. Working for him was like a golden ticket in many ways. Do a good job, and you'd be at the head of any list you wanted to be on. A year or two of misery opened so many doors that I couldn't pass up that offer, really. Maybe that makes me as bad as him on some level, but I comforted myself with the fact that I genuinely just wanted to be in a position to make a real difference, even if no one ever really knew my name. We were sitting in one of 4 little aluminium dinghies, pottering slowly up a narrow tidal creek into one of the largest mangrove swamps in the region, and one that had never really been scientifically investigated. Wexley was heading up a wildlife survey, keen to attach his name to as many new species as he could. He sat behind one of the younger female graduates. Predictably, his leering gaze burning holes into her backside. Goddamn creep. I turned my attention away from him, content to gaze into the forbidding mangroves as we slid past. The elder's warning stuck in my head, and in that twisted maze of ancient mangroves, I definitely felt a chill. The place was creepy, no doubt. The swamp itself opened up before us, not too far down the creek. The narrow channel spilling into a shallow depression spread over 25 square kilometers. Weaving erratically between the mangroves were deeper channels where the water drained with the tide. And dotted around the swamp were tiny spits of dry land that varied in size from a few meters to several hundred. The first thing I noticed, of course, were the crocodiles. They startled into the water as the boats approached, or popped their heads under the surface with a barely perceptible swirl. They were the biggest danger of doing any work in the Northern Territory, capable of happily taking a human, and even a 5-meter animal can be completely invisible in 2 feet of water. Because of the crocodiles, we had to find a decent piece of land on which to make camp. Aerial shots showed that towards the middle of the swamp there existed a sizable island where we would be at least a few hundred meters from the water. So we slowly wound our way through the mangrove-choked channels towards it. A few hundred meters obviously doesn't make you completely safe from crocs, but it all helps. Especially when one side of the island turns out to be a sheer 2-meter drop into the water. Crocodiles are very poor climbers. With camp set up near the steeper bank, and a hot wire stretching low to the ground around the perimeter to at least make any marauding reptiles think twice, we settled in for the first night. This was usually the one time on expedition that we could guarantee that sleazebag Wexley would leave us alone, given his steadfast refusal to mingle with us commoners in a social sense. We cooked on an open fire, told tall tales and ghost stories, and just generally enjoyed being free of the man for a few hours. That night, in my tent, I had the strangest dream. As with most dreams, I only remembered snatches of it, but they were still enough to set an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach for the whole morning. I was floating in black water, surrounded by dozens of crocodiles in a circle, lazily eyeing me off. I started to panic, treading water in faster and faster circles to try and keep an eye on them all at once. And then, one of them broke ranks and started drifting towards me. I braced for an attack, but before it came, the crocodile morphed into an image of the elder from earlier. His skin was unnaturally black. His beard and hair had turned shockingly white, and his eyes glowed with a purple fire. He stood on the surface of the water, with those purple eyes boring into me, leaning down slightly, whispering, "The Keeper awakens." Then, he shot down into the water in a plume of spray, sending the crocodiles scattering, and I woke up. The next day, I mercifully found myself free of Wexley again. He assigned me the task of overseeing the crocodile traps, because as part of the survey, we wanted to get an idea of the number and the size of the animals in the area, start tracking some of them to see where they went at different times of the year and so forth. Typical Wexley. He genuinely saw more value in the opportunity to discover a new species of gnat that he could name after himself than in studying the largest predator in the ecosystem. Not that I was going to complain about not having to be around him. We had brought 4 traps with us, 10-meter long reinforced steel cages that could either float on the surface of the water in a special rig or rest on the bottom in the shallows on the bank. They were designed so that even the truly huge 5 or 6 meter crocodiles could be safely contained, tagged and sampled before release, so they weighed quite a lot and were ungainly to transport. As a result, we had to set them up one at a time before heading back to base camp and picking up the next trap. It took pretty much all day. We baited them with feral pig carcasses and set them where we thought the big crocs would probably hang out. From then, it was really just a matter of waiting. Back at camp, Wexley had already returned and summoned me to his tent to marvel at some potential new species or another. A yellow eel, in fact. But despite his self-important boasting, I was pretty sure he'd just caught a rare colour morph of the common swamp eel. Still, I knew better than to correct him, and so I just agreed that it could be a promising find and told him I smelled like boar innards and needed a shower. After a quick soap job, I threw on a fresh set of clothes and retired to the main fire, happy to while away the night in the company of the other workers. Sleep was, as far as I could tell, dreamless that night, and I woke feeling re-energized. Hopefully we'd have something in the traps, and the real science could begin, while Wexley gallivanted uselessly about the other side of the swamp, looking for the next unfortunate creature to bear his name. Unfortunately, the traps were empty. Not a huge setback by any means. Crocodiles are surprisingly wary of changes in their environment, especially for such a powerful and aggressive predator, and it might take a couple of days before they approach closely enough to really get a bead on the bait. Once they did, though, that wariness would disappear in an instant. I decided that since we had no crocodiles to wrestle, we should start a bit of a catalogue of the animals we could see in the swamp. Because of the sparsity of dry land, there were very few large animals. But still, the mangroves were full of life. We photographed birds, lizards and crabs that scurried in between the breathing roots at low tide, and even a huge colony of flying foxes high up in some of the tall gums, right on the edge of the swamp itself. Then, as we came around the back edge of the swamp, we entered a relatively wide lagoon that seemed strangely devoid of life. No birds moved through the leaves of the mangroves or stalked mud skippers on the margins. Nothing stirred. The water beneath us, previously never more than about 6 or 7 feet deep, plummeted to over 30 feet. I heard a splash off to the right just as we rounded the corner into the bay, turning just in time to see a huge swirl on the surface of the water. Something very large submerged. Crocodiles basically exist in a sort of loose territorial hierarchy, with the bigger and older males ruling over the territory, while the smaller males jostle for position beneath them. Eventually, the smaller males grow larger and are forced to either challenge the dominant male or leave the river and move to a new territory. We had just found the perfect territory for a dominant super croc, and that splash told me that he wasn't too far away. I decided to move one of the nearby traps into the little creek that led into the wider expanse of open water, reasoning that, at some stage, our super croc would have to pass it on his way in or out. If we could get data on the dominant croc in a reasonably untouched area, it could do a lot for our knowledge of the species. We set the trap, added a bit more bait to it to make it even more enticing, and then headed back home to rest for the night. That night, I dreamed again, but these were more like genuine nightmares. Disjointed images and emotions, flashes of mangrove swamp and black water, tainted with rage and hate. I woke up in a puddle of sweat just before dawn, genuine adrenaline flowing through my veins. We checked the nearest traps to camp, and sure enough, this time we had caught a couple of middling males, both around the 4-meter mark. They were perfect candidates for the long-term tags because they were approaching the size where crocodiles start to look for their own territory. A swamp like this one acted as a fantastic nursery, and it would be of great interest to us where the animals that eventually moved on from here ended up. Both were released missing only a few vials of blood and a single scale from their tails, which would be used for DNA analysis. The third trap still sat empty, and given we'd only just moved the fourth, I decided to let it soak for another day or so. The food in there was enough to keep a crocodile alive for a year or more, and the position of the trap meant that there could be no danger of an animal overheating or drowning. It wouldn't hurt to leave it undisturbed for a while, especially because the bigger crocs are usually the wilier ones. 2 days later, we headed back towards the very back of the swamp, eager to see if we had had any luck. We had since caught another 2 crocodiles over 4 meters long, an indication that the dominant animal must be even larger. We were potentially in record territory, given the undisturbed nature of the place. But we were not at all prepared for what we found as we came around the bend of the small stream. The trap was gone. For a moment, I felt panic at the fate of the crocodile that must have entered it, thinking that maybe it somehow managed to shift the trap into deeper water, sank and drowned. These things were designed to hold a 1-ton slab of thrashing muscle firm, but I couldn't see any other reason it would be missing completely. I would have been shattered if we'd caught the big boy, only to have him die in our trap. And I cursed myself for not checking it earlier. Not far into the bay, though, I saw something much worse. The trap was sitting on the shoreline, empty. Empty and torn open like a flimsy birdcage. There were a chorus of gasps that echoed my own horrified confusion. How the hell could something like that happen? I noticed a severed tail tangled in the wrecked steel, and my hand flew to my mouth. Was that the remains of the dominant crocodile we'd been looking for? And what the hell had happened? Without a lot of choice, we motored over and surveyed the carnage. The first thing I noticed was that the tail was only relatively small, probably from an animal no larger than 3.5 meters, certainly not from a true giant. But that only brought up more questions. What had happened to the trap? Someone suggested poachers, trying to blow it open and getting the charge wrong. And someone else agreed, but I just couldn't. Surely we would have heard the explosion. I began to stare fearfully at the deep, dark waters of the lagoon. Could there possibly be a crocodile down there, big enough to do that to a reinforced steel trap? Of course, Wexley blamed me for whatever happened out in the lagoon, and I had to spend a good hour trapped in his tent while he raged and screamed. Over the course of his ranting, I apparently used a flimsy trap, sabotaged the trap to ruin his good name somehow, advertised our presence to poachers, had been working with the poachers, and eventually became the poacher myself. I'm sure there was more, but I just tuned it out and assured him that I'd get to the bottom of it. I really had no idea how I'd get to the bottom of it, but I would have to, because if I didn't, Wexley was liable to block me from working anywhere decent ever again out of sheer spite. Part of my solution lay in setting up camera traps on the 3 ways in and out of the deeper lagoon where the trap had been destroyed. At least that way, I thought, I might get an image of any potential poachers creeping around. Give Wexley someone else to rage at. I still didn't believe the poacher explanation theory, but what else could it be? Nothing else unusual happened for a few days, and the cameras picked up nothing out of the ordinary. We just went about our work, although my dreams continued to be dark and strange, and I didn't sleep all that well. Then, a few days after the incident with the trap, one of the boats failed to return. We were laid back ourselves, having caught a couple of small crocodiles, and when we arrived back to camp, it was buzzing with activity. Apparently the missing dinghy had managed to radio just one word, help, before all communication was lost. I immediately feared the worst, not even thinking about the trap incident, and figured they must have been overturned by a big crocodile. There have been plenty of cases where larger animals have stalked and ambushed boats, sometimes throwing the occupants into the water. I became even more concerned when I learned that they had been operating down one of the channels that lead out of that lagoon, down the far end of the swamp where even I had yet to venture. Wexley posed a problem though. He flat out forbade any attempt to go and find the missing researchers. He said they were probably just lost and refused to entertain the idea that anything bad might have happened to them.
Nonsense, you idiot. These same slackers have been behind on their work for days. No doubt they're just catching up, or their incompetence has them lost. They'll learn a valuable lesson spending a night out in the swamp.
As if this fat fuck hadn't just spent the whole week and a bit looking for living vanity plates. I stopped short of saying that to his face, of course, but I did tell him in no uncertain terms that I was going to find the missing researchers. He went so red I thought his eyes might start bleeding, and told me that if I defied him I could expect to never work in the field again. But recommendations be damned. I couldn't live with myself if one or more of those researchers were in trouble, and I did nothing about it. Thankfully, the rest of the crew agreed with me, and Wexley was powerless against the numbers and unwilling to dent his image by making a scene. Myself and 5 others piled into 2 separate boats and headed off as quickly as we dared through the dark, narrow channels. A northern Australian mangrove swamp is no place for humans to be poking around at night. Out there, the darkness belongs to the crocodiles. Even with the rifles we carried for the worst case scenario, it's no good shooting at something that you can't even see. We had to take our time making sure we didn't run into a submerged log or any other obstacle that might put us in the middle of the food chain. Back near the lagoon, we were once again greeted by the oppressive silence, as though the whole swamp was holding its breath. The very far end of the lagoon looked utterly foreboding, the mangroves almost forming a tunnel over the small channel that the missing group had been working in, shrouding it from any natural light. The limbs of the trees caught the spotlights, giving them a beckoning, skeletal appearance that only made the inky pool of darkness further down the stream even less inviting. I scanned the lagoon, the idea of a monster croc re-emerging at the back of my mind. But it was as still as glass, apart from our own wake, and shortly we were enveloped by that darkness as we entered the small creek. It didn't take long to find the boat, although it wasn't in the creek. Somehow, it had been wedged in a thicket of mangroves, maybe 3 meters off the ground. Had it come in too fast and clipped the bank? We pulled cautiously into the mud, and against my better judgment, I got out of the boat. The mud gripped my ankles like grasping hands, and getting over to the strangely suspended dinghy was a real slog. Shining a torch on the hull, I felt my jaw drop at the extent of the damage. The thick aluminium, jagged and torn all down the right-hand side of the boat. That could not have been caused by the soft riverbank. Caught up in marveling at the state of the boat, I almost missed the moment to my right. Deeper in the thick mangroves and away from the water. A figure rose from the mud, and I flinched, almost dropping the torch as it began charging towards me as fast as the mud would allow. I calmed slightly when I recognized it as one of the missing members, although his maddened eyes kept me well on edge as he approached. I braced myself in case of collision, but he sloshed straight past me, uttering a single word: "Run!" Despite the man's panic and his insistence that they were all dead, we made a point of searching for the others he had been with. The thick mud and heavy darkness made it hard, and we couldn't do too much on foot anyway, so we had to throw in the towel after about an hour. Wexley, the man who had raged against anyone even going searching, now raged that we hadn't found the other two at any cost. One of the workers threatened to throw him in the swamp, and he stormed off to his tent in a temper. The scientist we rescued could shed almost no light on the situation. Whatever had happened seemed to have sent him into a shock. Since picking him up, he had said next to nothing and not responded to any questions. All he did was mutter to himself, repeating the same sentence. It was so big. So big. I was forced reluctantly to accept that my initial theory had been correct. They must have run afoul of a big croc. Although I had no explanation for how the boat wound up so heavily damaged and up in a tree. Maybe the two unfortunate others had fallen in when the croc hit the boat, and the survivor had gunned the engine and hit a submerged rock or something like that near the bank. In my haste to find a logical explanation, I simply glossed over how far up the creek the boat had been. A huge mistake in hindsight, because the creek didn't offer any opportunity for the chain of events I'd imagined. At the time, though, I just accepted that I must be at least on the right track, made sure the injured survivor was comfortable and monitored, and then went to bed. After all, I figured we'd be setting out on a body recovery mission in the morning. That night, I dreamed again. The same out-of-focus snatches of erratic imagery.